Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the second session of the 10th annual CSIS South China Sea Conference. This is going to be the second of a set of 4 panel discussions that we'll hold running through October, recognizing this strange new normal that we're all in. And I'm really happy to see that we've had great turnout for both of the first 2. Today, we're going to be discussing legal issues, given recent background we've had with a series of notes verbal at the UN since December, recent US policy statement from Secretary Pompeo last month, and ongoing debate about whether or not Vietnam will bring its own arbitration. So before we get into it, I should recognize our sponsors. This conference is made possible by support from the Foundation for EC Studies, the Embassy of Japan, and the Embassy of New Zealand, as well as general support to CSIS. The way the show is going to run is that we'll have each of our speakers give 5 or 10 minutes of remarks, and then we're going to move into a moderated Q&A. Now, given the size of the audience on Zoom, we're going to use the Q&A function, and I will read questions to the panelists. So if you have any questions that come up either during their presentations or once we move into Q&A, go ahead and type it into the Q&A function in Zoom. I would ask that you please identify yourself and your organization so that the speakers know who they're responding to. And with that, why don't I get out of the way for our esteemed panelists. First, we're going to start with Robert Beckman. Bob Beckman is head of the Ocean Law and Policy Program at the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore, and he was the center's founding director. Bob's also an emeritus professor at the NUS Faculty of Law, where he has taught ocean law and policy for many years. And this past May, he was nominated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Vietnam as an arbitrator under Annex 7 of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Then we'll move to, if he gets on, we were going to move to James Kraska, who will be our second speaker. And James seems to be having some technical difficulties, so we're going to give him a few minutes. If he's not able to, we'll roll right into what would be our closing speaker. So batting last will be Pham Ngoc Minh Chang, who is a lecturer at Vietnam National University in Ho Chi Minh City. She teaches international law and law of the sea. She was a research fellow at the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in 2015. And last year, Cham received a scholarship from the Fulbright U.S. Asean Visiting Scholar Program to conduct research at the U.S. Asia Law Institute at NYU School of Law. So with that, why don't I throw it to Bob? Bob, the floor is yours. You're still muted.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be with you. Good morning to those of you in the United States. It's a good evening here. I'm going to be summarizing a little bit the situation with respect to the legal issues, and then talking about the lawfare, the series of diplomatic notes, and then making some general observations. I'm trying now to share screen. I hope that this are we now on? Is the screen on, Greg?
Yes, it is. Okay,
I'm going to show you the first slide on this picture. You now see the slide of the May 2009 submission of Malaysia. My position here is that the modern maritime disputes actually started in 2009. Before then, states had ratified the convention, they'd claimed an economic zone, but we never knew where the Southeast Asian countries were claiming their zone from. We did not know whether they were claiming a zone from the islands that they claimed sovereignty over, only from their coast. In order to make a submission to the Continental Shelf Commission, they had to clarify this by first showing where their 200-mile limit was. And therefore, in May 2009, we have the joint submission by Vietnam and Malaysia. And you can see from the map that they submitted with their partial submission, it showed that they were drawing a 200-mile economic zone. They weren't claiming anything from an island, they were claiming it from their mainland coast. They were also kind enough to show us where Philippines' the 200-mile economic zone would be. Now, the very next day, China submitted a note verbal objecting to the joint submission, stating that they had indisputable sovereignty over the islands and their adjacent waters, sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the relevant waters, and it's the attached map, and this is where the infamous 9-line map has now come into the picture, and this created a great deal of concern as to what exactly they were claiming. Adjacent waters could be interpreted as territorial sea, but relevant waters is not a legal term of art. I'll then jump to the decision on the tribunal, which, a summary for those that are not aware, this is the 200-mile claim zones of the Philippines and Malaysia. Here it's Vietnam. The court had a map which showed what the 200-mile or what the 9-line claim would mean, but they basically rejected the 9-line as a basis for claiming any sovereign rights or historic rights. They also rejected the idea that any of the islands could be entitled to more than a 12-mile territorial sea. So the only areas left in dispute are the little small circles in white surrounded by. In other words, those are the features the court determined were naturally formed and above water at high tide, entitled to a 12-mile territorial sea. They concluded that none of them were entitled to an economic zone or continental shelf of their own. So the decision severely limited the areas in dispute. In effect, if the decision is followed, all of the economic zone of the coastal countries and Indonesia's would come up as well. They would have sovereign rights to all of the fisheries resources and all the minerals and hydrocarbons, except for the small circles around the islands. This again is a final map which I'm putting up, which shows you the impact of the outer continental shelf claims. This was the joint submission made in 2009 by Malaysia and Vietnam. Vietnam then made a separate submission up the orange block above that. The one that we're discussing today, the Malaysians, is just north of the joint submission, overlapping a little bit with the KIG or Kalialan claim of the Philippines and overlapping a little bit with some of the circles that are in dispute. But the key is, I think, to understand, if you look at Vietnam, for example, there are basically no disputed areas in their 200-mile economic zone, except for a tiny couple dots right by the joint submission area, where most of the disputed areas are where the islands are located that everybody claims sovereignty over are off the coast of either Malaysia or Vietnam. I'll now move to my main submission or my main presentation. The Malaysian partial submission was made in 2009 in December. It was actually dated November 2017, but it apparently was not submitted until a couple of years later. And it triggered a lawfare, what we call a lawfare diplomatic note barrage. Diplomatic note, China replied immediately to Malaysia. The Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Malaysia then responded to the note submitted by China. The United States submitted a note and also a letter by the foreign ministry, and Australia submitted a letter as well, and China has replied to all of them. The one thing that's new in China's note, which is consistent with what they have said after 2016, is they made reference not only to historic rights, but they described their claim to the islands as a claim to 4 island groups, and claiming that the groups are entitled to maritime zones. They then asserted that their claim from the four island groups as well as historic rights is consistent with international law. I'll then quick jump to a summary of the diplomatic notes submitted by the various parties. I should also mention that ASEAN has made, two foreign ministers have made a statement in January emphasizing that UNCLOS is the basis for determining sovereign rights and legitimate interests over maritime areas. And then they submitted a chairman's statement of the ASEAN Summit in June of 2020, saying for the first time, UNCLOS is the basis for determining maritime entitlements, sovereign rights, jurisdiction, and legitimate interests in maritime zones. So ASEAN itself has put more emphasis on UNCLOS than they had in the past. Otherwise, the summary of the diplomatic notes that I've mentioned that were put forward, let me quickly draw some conclusions. I'm sorry, all of the objecting states have challenged the legality of China's claims to sovereign rights and jurisdiction in the South China Sea, based either on historic rights or somehow the 9-dash line. 4 of the countries, Philippines, Vietnam, US, and Australia, have challenged the legality of China's right to treat the islands as a group or as a unit and draw straight baselines from the unit. The Philippines, Indonesia, US, and Australia have supported their arguments by direct reference to the arbitral award, the decision of 2016 tribunal. Vietnam has, in effect, paraphrased or used the language of the award, but has not expressly referred to the award. All of the objecting states have, of course, put great emphasis on UNCLOS. The US Secretary of State Pompeo's statement of 13 July emphasized again that the award is final and binding, and asserted that the US is aligning its position on the Chinese claims with the decision of the arbitral tribunal. And I think the most significant part of the US statement by Pompeo from the Southeast Asians' point of view, it is the first time that anyone has shown or made an assertion as to what the US position in the tribunal means in terms of other states' claims in their economic zone. And he expressly mentioned that it rejects US rejects any maritime claim by China in the waters surrounding Vanguard Bank off Vietnam, Lacuna Shoals off Malaysia, the waters in Brunei's economic zone, or the waters of Indonesia off the Natuna Islands. So the US took the logical jump of what does the arbitral award mean with respect to the economic zones of the other states, Southeast Asian countries bordering the South China Sea. They also, Pompeo mentioned that China could not claim any sovereignty of any type over submerged features such as James Shoal or Macclesfield Bank, and they also mentioned the no lawful claim to Mischief Reef or Second Thomas Shoal because they're low tidal villages located within the economic zone of the Philippines, and therefore jurisdiction would lie with the Philippines under international law. The final I felt that I put in bold when I did look at his statement is that America stands with our Southeast Asian allies and partners in protecting their sovereign rights to offshore resources consistent with their rights and obligations under international law. So what does this all mean in terms of the lawfare? We not only have the Southeast Asian countries being more assertive at asserting their rights and mentioning UNCLOS and the arbitral award, you also have 2 external powers, 1 superpower coming in plus Australia. And you have the ASEAN states being more vocal in citing the award in international law than they did after the decision itself in 2016. There's clearly a change of attitude. due in part, I think, to that China is being increasingly viewed as a threat to the rules-based order set out in UNCLOS, because it's asserting rights in particular to the ocean resources that belong to their neighbors. What are the options going forward? Greg asked me to mention this. Let me know if my time is up. What are the US options? Again, it can continue FONAPs as it has. It can increase them to challenge what it believes are excessive maritime claims. But at least as I understand FONAPs, they're not a very effective remedy for dealing with China asserting rights in the maritime zones of other states. The other states' right is being interfered with. It's up to them to assert rights. The US could assist them, and I think they're already doing that in some cases, providing technical training, in giving equipment, giving vessels to them, so that they can, Southeast Asian countries can better police their own waters. And there's been a hint the following day after Pompeo's statement by Mr. Stilwell that they might consider sanctions against companies. What does this mean in terms of ASEAN? I think what ASEAN fears is we don't want to turn this into having to make a choice between the two superpowers who seem to be moving more and more into a power struggle, with the part of it being played out in the South China Sea. I think if people expect ASEAN to choose sides, they're going to be disappointed, because ASEAN, both individual states and ASEAN as a group, which has to act on the basis of a consensus, is going to be highly unlikely to make a clear choice favoring one side or the other, at least in terms of the big power struggle, even though they may be completely in line with the US in terms of the legal analysis in the South China Sea. ASEAN states are likely to encourage the US and China to establish queues-like arrangements for unplanned encounters at sea. As I understand queues, it applies only Navy to Navy. Sometimes the US Navy may be coming up against Coast Guard, and Coast Guards do have a different line of communication. They don't communicate directly. You also have problems, which James might talk about, of maritime militia vessels, and how unplanned encounters between foreign naval vessels and either Coast Guard or maritime militia is something that we should be thinking about to avoid any incidents at sea. Final point is that Greg asked me to look a little bit at, or talk a little bit about, ways forward in terms of international law. I think our colleague from Vietnam will be talking about the potential for another arbitration case. I would ask the parties perhaps might consider voluntary conciliation. Conciliation is voluntary, it's not binding, but sometimes with neutral third parties attempting to bridge the gaps between the two sides, they can put forward a sort of face-saving solutions which give states a legal basis, or at least a basis for adjusting the positions they have with respect to some of the disputes. Another issue that I've thought about is perhaps since all the countries in the Gulf of Thailand and the surrounding the South China Sea are parties to the 95 Fish Stocks Agreement, with the exceptions of Malaysia and China, the Southeast Asian countries might think about establishing a regional fishing management organization in the Gulf of Thailand and the southern sector of the South China Sea. And I guess the final issue that could be looked upon is there any kind of comprehensive deal that China could make with respect to resources, where CNOCC could enter into wide economic relationships with some of its neighbors, in which it has the right to the resources under this wider arrangement. I think attempting to say joint development is not going to work, because joint development suggests both sides have a legitimate claim, and the Southeast Asian countries wouldn't be able to do that. I'll stop there. Happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob. In the name of alphabetical order, we'll move to James next. So James Kraska is the chair and Charles H. Stockton Professor of International Maritime Law in the Stockton Center for International Law at the U.S. Naval War College. He is a visiting professor of law and the John Harvey Gregory Lecturer on World Organization at Harvard Law School, where he teaches international law at the sea. And he was previously a visiting professor at a whole lot of places, including the University of the Philippines College of Law. So with that, James, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Greg, and thank you to CSIS. There's been no other policy institution that has advanced rule of law in the South China Sea than CSIS globally, so it's an honor to be able to participate in the conversation. This is the legal panel, and so I thought I'd give a few thoughts on law as just one element of the overall picture in the South China Sea, but it's not an insignificant element, and it has been catching up. So when Secretary Pompeo gave his short presentation on July 13th, he rejected the notion that might makes right, and that the rule of law should prevail in the South China Sea. He talked about how China undermines the sovereign rights of countries in the area, bullying all resources and asserting unilateral dominion, and mentioned those legal issues, those defects in the law of the sea that Bob Beckman had just referred to. So the Trump administration can be credited, in my view, with raising the expectation that law has meaning. And this has been a bipartisan weakness in the United States, rejecting the Malayan dialogue that the powerful do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. So it somewhat begins to repair the deficiency or the weakness, the Trump approach to China in the South China Sea and in some other areas of the relationship. And in doing so, I think it's beneficial. It also emboldens other states to take the same approach. So it has helped or contributed to a growing awareness of the scope or the gravity of the challenge of China, indeed of the threat of China. But of course, it's not been perfect as a human endeavor, and certainly our president is very human in that regard. It has missed some very important pieces that are also required to develop international law. International law is a community process of authoritative decision, and it's dependent entirely on engagement. And so on this score, there's a lot that could have been done better and should be done better in the future with regard to the US approach, both in the past as well as especially in the current approach, where you take opportunities to alienate potential allies without any good cause, where you reject international institutions that probably would help to strengthen overall stability and build bridges. And so I'll give just a few examples, and then I'll close and turn it over to my colleague Min. There are several elements or factors in the South China Sea and in the China-US bilateral relationship. One is economic, a foundation really of national power. And in this regard, the US approach has not optimized engagement and building relationships, either within the World Trade Organization process or taking unforced errors, taking opportunities to decline engagement through processes such as the TPP trade relationship. So there has been a benefit in insisting on more reciprocal relations economically. I think that that's good. And also, particularly in light of the COVID situation, I think most countries realize that some level of partial disengagement with the China supply chain is called for, is beneficial, and it's already happening. And there may even be some occasions for sanctions for economic violations. But of course, the United States is a powerful country, but just one country, and so it would act much more strongly if it did these if it raised these ideas within a multilateral context, and either within existing organizations or creating new organizations economically. So that's the first material factor. The second material factor is military, and the U.S. has done a little better there, although still not entirely as well as it could have. And for the military aspect, the United States has it relies on military alliances, such as with Japan and Australia, and then requires also strategic partners, such as Vietnam or India, to maintain security and stability. And here the United States also could have a more holistic approach to these countries. Just one example, picking sometimes seemingly insignificant petty fights with allies in Europe or even Japan. When time would have been better spent, more productively spent in trying to ensure that that allies are on the same page. There's a lot of work to be done in this regard, and the U.S. and other countries are responding militarily to the military challenge, for example, in the realm of hypersonics or autonomous weapons or artificial intelligence that China and Russia are quite advanced in. An example of where multilateral negotiations might help would be in the United States trying to leverage other countries to convince China to come into an intermediate nuclear forces agreement, rather than the United States just being a sole voice. All the countries in East Asia have that in their national interest, yet of course they're somewhat obviously reticent to kind of go out on a limb and start talking about that. Only the United States has. So the United States should be working with these other countries to try to bring them into that security architecture. Then last, I'll end with, those are the two material factors. I'll end with the intangible factor of international law, and that could even be the strongest suit for the United States and like-minded countries, and that is the aspects of universal values in international law. It's really what the Communist Party of China fears the most, and I don't mean sort of a Pollyannish view, but looking at international law and these universal values as an element of power, that can be used to bring about stability and security. And how can that happen independent of the economic and military international law that I just mentioned? I would just leave you with this. One example could be something like the Helsinki Accords that began in 1972 and really grew out of the CSCE, now the OSCE in Europe, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And in the present day, you might analogize the situation of Asean and regional states as that of Finland during the Cold War, in which Finland had sympathies, of course, as a Western country, but then had to be very careful about sharing a 1,000-kilometer land border with the Soviet Union, with Russia. The Helsinki Accords provided a multilateral institution for the United States and all countries to debate what are the meanings of terms such as human rights. And in that respect, it was an important, maybe even the defining element of Western Cold War strategy to link human rights to things that were going on in the Soviet Union, such as the condition of Jews inside the Soviet Union, very much analogous to the situation of Uyghurs and other minorities within China today. This Helsinki process culminated in 1990 with the Copenhagen Document. Now, this was already after the fall of the Berlin Wall, so it was very aspirational, requiring or understanding or expecting states, both East and West, would comply with a whole range of liberal values on media, on free elections, on human dignity, criminal justice, and the rest. But I realize that China understands and probably sees that as somewhat of a trap that the West had laid, which is ironic because the Helsinki process was actually initiated from the Soviet side and from Finland. But it still serves as a multilateral model and helping to shore up this essential piece of multilateral engagement, which is the weakest part of the US response. Thank you.
Thanks, James. And our last speaker is going to be Famnyup Minchang, who I introduced at the top of the program. So Chang, the floor is yours.
Unmute myself. Thank you very much, CSIS, for organizing this event, and thank you, Rick, for inviting me. I'm really honored. And usually when a Vietnamese scholar comes to a conference or discussing South China Sea dispute, these questions will always be asked. Will Vietnam take China to court? And you will receive the answer like, it's a political decision and we as a scholar cannot answer that. And it's true. But let's agree with each other on the premise that litigation is always an option on the table because it's normal, it's legal, and it's a civil life practice of the international community when it comes to an international dispute. So Vietnam can take China to an international judicial body of international law to settle the dispute. But prior to submitting a case against China before an international court, Vietnam had to answer 3 questions. The first question is what to submit, what issues or what's dispute between Vietnam and China that Vietnam can bring to the court. And where to submit, it means what international courts will have jurisdiction to entertain the case. And finally, when to submit, when can Vietnam satisfy all the condition in the international law to submit the case. Now let's move to the first question, what to submit. Vietnam and China have various kinds of dispute in the South China Sea. But in order to successfully submit a case before an international court, Vietnam have to choose the dispute that under the interpretation and application of UNCLOS, that the Law of the Sea Convention. And those disputes must not fall into the limitation and exception stipulated in Section 3, Chapter 15 of the Law of the Sea Convention. So Vietnam cannot ask the court to decide any issue related to sovereignty. That means Vietnam cannot ask the court to decide either Vietnam or China have sovereignty on the certain of maritime feature at sea. Vietnam cannot ask the court to decide any issue related to maritime delimitation either. Vietnam cannot ask the court to decide the overlapping zone between Vietnam and China at sea. But Vietnam can ask the court to decide the legal status of maritime features in Paracel Islands. Vietnam holds the view that offshore maritime features in Paracel North Island, and they cannot generate further than 12 nautical miles of maritime zone around themselves. And China obviously hold the conflicting points of view. And the second question that Vietnam can ask the court is that Vietnam can ask the court to denounce the legalities of the system of the straight baseline rolled by China around Paracel. According to the Law of the Sea Convention, this kind of practice only applicable to archipelagic state. China is a coastal state, so the Law of the Sea Convention does not support this kind of practice. It's unlawful, and no other customary international law support this kind of practice either. And finally, Vietnam can ask the court to decide certain activity of China toward Vietnam as unlawful, such as sinking Vietnamese fishing boats, sending the survey ship to the EEZ of Vietnam, and conducting maritime research without any permission of the Vietnamese government. And also China continuously disturbing the oil exploration and exploration activity of Vietnam in the continental shelf of Vietnam. So those are the issues that Vietnam can submit to the court. Now, let's move to the next question, where to submit. So according to the Law of the Sea Convention, we have 4 international courts and tribunals that can settle maritime dispute. The first one is the ICJ, International Court of Justice. The second one is ITLOS, International Tribunal for Law of the Sea. And the third one is the Arbitral Tribunal established under Annex 7 of the Law of the Sea Convention. And finally, a special tribunal established under Annex 8 of the Law of the Sea Convention. So given the natures of the dispute that I have just mentioned and the anticipated denial attitude of China toward litigation, so the only option for Vietnam may be just the arbitral tribunal established under Annex 7 of UNCLOS. And in international law, we have the concept of consent in advance. It means that when a country signs and ratifies an international convention, this convention contains compulsory procedures of dispute settlement. That country agreed with the scenario that in the future, a member of that convention can bring a case against that country without explicit consent at that moment. And it works both ways, that country can also sue other member of the convention unilaterally. And this explains the lawfulness of the South China Sea case between the Philippines and China in 2013. And Vietnam can also apply that legal technique to the case of Vietnam. Let's move to the final question, when to submit. So before submitting the case, Vietnam had to satisfy 3 conditions. First is Vietnam had to prove that it's already satisfied the obligation of exchanging view. The second obligation is that Vietnam had to prove that there is no settlement has been reached between Vietnam and China by using the method that agreed between Vietnam and China, which is negotiation. And the last condition is Vietnam had to prove that there's no other arrangement under bilateral or regional agreement, which Vietnam and China are the party of, excludes and privilege the compulsory procedure in UNCLOS. And we can see that there's countless of meetings between the government of Vietnam and the government of China discussing the South China Sea dispute between themselves, and countless of meetings of Vietnam and China under the mechanism of Asean, negotiating DOC, negotiating COC. And the primary example of the changing view is that the hitting no verbal battle between claimants in the South China Sea in the Commission for the limits of the continental shelf at the UN right now. So we can say that Vietnam has already fulfilled the obligation of a changing view. And that's also proved that negotiation doesn't work in the South China Sea anymore. And those parties conduct negotiation in good faith, because you look at the discourse of their Ministry of Foreign Affairs talking about the dispute, you can say that they all have good faith to want to settle this dispute, but negotiation failed. And there's no bilateral or regional agreement between Vietnam and China explicitly exclude the compulsory procedure of UNCLOS. So now we can see that Vietnam right now satisfied all the conditions that can submit a case against China before an international court. And Vietnam can or may achieve the victorious award like the Philippines did in 2016. But then the next question is, now what? What are we gonna do with the judgment if China continues to ignore it and boycott it? So there's something that China is doing in the South China Sea that we should not overlook. China is trying to change the geopolitical reality in the South China Sea, promotes new legal order, to consolidate its gain, and eventually China will enter the legal order in the South China Sea, which mostly benefits only China. A judgment from an international court is the shield to protect the rules-based order in South China Sea, because it gives all the powerful states such as the US, Australia, Japan, or India the legitimacy to condemn China, the action of China in the South China Sea, to take the side with smaller claimants in the South China Sea to protect the rules-based order of the South China Sea. And that's the benefits of the judgment. And that's also conclude my presentation today. Thank you very much, and I'm welcome any question.
Thanks, John. Now we have about 18 minutes on the official clock for questions. We can probably run a few minutes over, but I want to be cognizant that it's getting a little late in Vietnam and Singapore, so I want to keep us somewhat close to time. So what I'm going to do is bundle as many of these together as I can and maybe go one by one, one question for each panelist. And I'll remind anybody, if you want to keep putting questions into the queue, please do, but please identify yourself and your institution so we know who we're talking to. So we had a couple questions about the COC process, and I'll just pick one out. We have Engin Mo from LSE who wants to know what are the implications of the recent ASEAN chairman statement. So I guess I'll throw this to Chang first, which states that disputes must be governed by UNCLOS, and how is that going to impact progress on the COC, if at all?
The impact of the newest statement of ASEAN is that it 3 times mentioned that the importance of international law to settle the dispute in the South China Sea, and also to protect the rules-based order in the region. So that means that international law has meaning, like Professor Braska said before, and maybe that's the foundation, and it's also the basis for all the ASEAN country negotiate COC. It's not just a political, how to say that, a political agreement, which is other, but also much based on international law, and that's a positive side of the development of ASEAN. And I hope that answers your question.
Thanks. Bob, do you have anything more to say on the COC that you didn't cover in your presentation? Is there still hope in your mind for a COC? You're still on mute.
I think it depends on what your objectives are for the COC. I don't think they're going to resolve, they certainly cannot resolve the sovereignty issues. They probably cannot resolve the maritime claims issues. What they can do is try to enhance cooperation on matters of mutual concern, whether it's search and rescue or protection of the marine environment, marine plastic debris, which might eventually improve the level of self-confidence of countries in each other. And I think most important, it can deal with a framework for dealing with incidents at sea and preventing conflict, whether it's hotlines or whether it is rules of engagement or rules of like the queues, etc. But I think if you expect it to be legally binding and resolve all the understanding issues, then I don't think there's much of a chance of that happening. My final point on this, it seems to be now that I sense that the Southeast Asian countries are going to go with more emphasis on UNCLOS with respect to resolving maritime claims in the South China Sea. And whether but again, it has to be by consensus, and therefore China has to agree. And China's friends in ASEAN have to agree. So I'm not real hopeful it's going to solve all the problems. There's no magic bullet.
Thanks. James, a question that I'm sure you've never gotten before. Isn't it time for the US to ratify UNCLOS?
Yes. It's actually past time that the United States joined the Law of the Sea Convention, particularly as it uses it as the framework for both within the US government and in our international engagement. and yet it's not a party to the law of the Sea Convention. We're not a party to the law of the Sea Convention, based mainly on some fairly spacious arguments by part of the Republican side of the aisle that are it's sort of a menagerie of different excuses, none of which are convincing at all. Primarily, they relate to the seabed mining provisions in the continental shelf. Suffice it to say that these are far more generous than what President Nixon sought for the United States, and the formulas were partially developed by ExxonMobil oil company. So they're very beneficial to the United States, which has, I believe, the longest coastline in the world. They're also, of course, immensely important for our economy and for global military power projection. So it's just a domestic and unfortunate casualty of domestic politics. And the United States certainly ought to join that convention. That's part of the lack of engagement that I had mentioned.
Thanks. So we have a question from Kentaro Furuya with the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies and the Japan Coast Guard Academy, which I'm going to tweak a little bit and ask to both Bob and Chang. So his question is about Article 121.3, which status of islands and the idea that none of the Spratlys are legally entitled to an EEZ and continental shelf. We've often heard the argument made that there is hypocrisy here and that the U.S., among many others, has islands of similar size. So Bob, in general, what do you make of the precedent here? I mean, is the precedent on Article 121.3 accepted enough that it is going to become customary international law, or is that a real weakness of the arbitration?
It's the probably most controversial part of the arbitral award. And I think we'll have to wait for more cases to see whether subsequent courts or tribunals to accept the reasoning in that case, especially with respect to Taiping or Etuaba, that not being capable of generating an economic zone or not. I think it's a sensitive issue in the United States. Japan is occupying features which are probably rocks by most people's definition. United States is, Australia is, and the general rule in practice seems to be if it's mine, it's an island. If it's yours, it's a rock. Now, I often ask people, you claim an economic zone around this feature. What if that offshore feature were occupied by France? Would you still claim that it's entitled to 200 nautical miles? Or are you claiming it because you own it? My final point would be, I think most countries, if there's an authoritative interpretation of a tribunal, every country should at least review its state practice to see whether its practice is consistent with the reasoning of that tribunal. And I don't think the US did much on that, and Japan didn't, and other states as well. Many other states.
And Chang, the question often comes up about the paracels and Vietnam's position vis-a-vis what is and is not an island. And I think if you look at the note verbal, for instance, to the CLCS, where you sit is where you stand, whether or not Vietnam has really endorsed this. My sense is that there's nothing explicit from Hanoi that has clearly said that all of the features in the South China Sea are rocks.
If you look at the note verbals of Vietnam in March 30th, 2020, you can see that Vietnam endorsed the idea or promotes the thought that non-offshore maritime features in the South China Sea island, because there's I remember there's explicitly one sentence saying that Vietnam believe that all the maritime feature in the South China Sea have to be judged under Article 121.3 of the Law of the Sea Convention, and that means and if you look at that provision, it's not about island, it's about rock cannot sustain human life or have economic life of their own. So I think it's very clear on the position of Vietnam toward the maritime feature at sea.
Thanks. And let's see, another question for James from Drake Long with Radio Free Asia and formerly of AMTI, I'll flip stomp. In reference to the U.S. complaints on the presumably uncontested election of another Chinese arbitrator to ITLOS, basically, what can the U.S. do about it? It's not a party to UNCLOS.
Thanks for the question, Drake. Good to hear from you. The United States can't do anything about it, and actually, it's a problem more generally for the states that are party to the Law of the Sea Convention because of the regional voting that's been established within the framework of not just ITLOS and the Law of the Sea, but is a feature of all of UN voting. And so there's an Asia seat, and China has been very politically adept at ensuring that it likely will fill that seat. And so what the United States can do, again, is it's sort of too little too late right now for that immediate question. What it can do in the future is to ensure that the United States is engaged with international institutions and working with like-minded states and friends and allies and partners to have their own approach and their own agenda, their own slate of candidates.
Yeah, Bob, please.
Greg, could I just comment on that? I tend to disagree with the statement of the Secretary of State on this issue. If you want China to be a law-abiding member of the international community, then I think it's in the world community's interest to have China as a member of the tribunal, or on the ITLOS. It has every right to be a member, because it's not complying with one decision doesn't mean that it can't have a judge on the if a big power is excluded from the tribunal, then it's less and less likely that it will join, for example, if there's another case. We don't know whether China will participate in it if a second case were brought. And certainly if they're excluded from the tribunal, it increases the possibility that they would fail to participate. So I'm not sure it's up to a state that's not a party to be telling states who they should vote for and who they should not vote for.
Tom?
If I may, I can chip in one thing about the voting for the judge at ITLOS. Right now, I mean, you can condemn that China doesn't abide to the arbitral tribunal award in 2016, but then nominates a judge to ITLOS. But at the same time, no other Asian country nominates anyone to the procedure. So you cannot condemn China. You should condemn all the country. And that's my point.
Thanks. Since we went around the horn on that one, let me go back to James with another question. This one from J.P. Villasor, who's Dean and Professor of Law at Recoletos School of Law in the Philippines. I'll shorten the question. Basically, what are the chances of the U.S. actually sanctioning Chinese entities in the South China Sea, and how effective do you think it would be?
I think there's a good chance that this administration will do that. They've already been talking, and they've on those sorts of issues, they've pleasantly surprised on the upside. So there's a decent chance that they will do so. As far as whether that will have any meaningful effect, of course, it should have been done in 2014 and 2015. That's all water under the bridge. But it raises the prospect that sanctions actually you can actually get some real work out of international law. And so maybe not in this setting, it would be more symbolic in this setting, but it may bear some fruit in some other settings. And again, particularly if you do it in conjunction with friends and allies, and you are able to broaden or multiply the effect of your force and authority by partnering with other states. If you can get the European Union on board and Japan on board, then I think you can have some meaningful impact.
Thanks. And let me, we'll give the last word here to Bob and Chang on a couple of broad questions I'll combine. One from Sebastian Vogel with the University of Gothenburg. Among several of his questions, one is basically, are there any good arguments left for China's claims? Does China have any legs left to stand on? And then there was another from Roman Kalisek on, do we know what the 9- line is yet? Do we have any more clarity than we did 11 years ago after the CLCS submissions on what exactly the 9- line means? Whoever would like to tackle those two first. First one to unmute can go.
Nine dash line, I don't think we have any better idea. Sorry, go ahead. Somebody else, go ahead.
The first question is there any argument for China in the South China Sea right now? I think that they can stress on the argument that any issues related to the maritime feature at sea will related to sovereignty, and you have to ask the other party, if you have to argue before the court, you have to argue to ask the other party to break the link between the legal status of maritime features and sovereignty, and that's a, I think it's an honor. It's a big argument that you have to make. And about the 9-dash line, if you look into the final award of the 2016. In 2016, we can see that the 9-dash line now have no legality or whatsoever, and the water inside the 9-dash line that China claim historic rights also, that claim is also unlawful and illegal. And Bob, please.
Okay, my take on the 9-dash line is I think it's I don't read Chinese, but I think the depiction on the 1947 map was location of Chinese islands in the South China Sea. I think that's exactly what the 9-dash line was intended to do, is to illustrate which islands China claimed sovereignty over. It had nothing to do with maritime claims from those islands or whether they indeed were islands. With respect to whether China has other rights and obligations, I would say yes. I think we sometimes read in the newspaper about the illegal militarization, the illegal putting weapons on islands. There's nothing in the tribunal's decision that says you cannot militarize an island which you claim sovereignty over and occupy. In terms of the reclamation or island building, the tribunal addressed that only by saying they were unlawful in that they damaged the marine environment. But the island building per se is not covered in the decision, and arguably it's still lawful. So we must be careful to read the decision and not say everything we don't like about China, we should claim it's illegal. I think in this respect, that China has been, there's no violation of international law in them putting military base on a feature which they occupy. Vietnam has had military facilities on islands for long before China did. They just don't have the scale that China has.
Thanks, Bob, and that brings us to exactly time, which is unusual in DC and even more rare on Zoom. So I'm gonna pull the plug there. And I know we can't get a round of applause on Zoom. I'm sure that the 201 participants, 200 participants now still on, are clapping for you. I'd invite everybody to stay tuned. We'll have our third session of the conference sometime next month, date to be set, so look in your inboxes. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, James. Thank you, Chang, for a really great conversation. Everybody have a great day or night, depending on where you are.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.